In the labyrinth of early 20th century New York, amidst the smog and the street gangs, one name began to rise above the chaos. Charles "Lucky" Luciano, once a street thug, would become the architect of a criminal empire that reshaped organized crime in America. His ambition wasn't just to survive, it was to control. From orchestrating wars to forming unholy alliances, Luciano built an empire with ruthless efficiency and unparalleled strategy. But power always comes at a price. As he climbed, the streets grew bloodier and loyalty turned into a weapon. The question isn't just how he rose, but at what cost? In the dimly lit alleys of early 20th century New York, amidst the chaos of a rapidly changing world, a young man named Charles "Lucky" Luciano was making his mark. The story of this man isn't simply one of crime. It is a tale of ambition, resilience, and an unflinching desire for power. His rise from a scrappy street kid in a gritty neighborhood to becoming the most powerful and feared mob boss in American history is both chilling and captivating. This is the story of how one man reshaped the entire landscape of organized crime, molding it into a business empire that would dominate for decades. At the core of Luciano's life was a paradox: the pursuit of an almost mythical kind of power, one that was ruthless in its ambition but strangely disciplined in its execution. It is a story that plays out like a Shakespearean tragedy, a tale where ambition becomes both a weapon and a curse. But to understand Luciano, you must first understand the world he came from. A world defined by poverty, racial tension, and a growing immigrant community struggling to carve out a place in a society that viewed them with suspicion and disdain. Born to Sicilian immigrants in 1897, Luciano's early life was shaped by the constant struggle for survival in a world that offered little room for mercy. The Lower East Side of New York City was a place where violence and crime were everyday occurrences. This was a neighborhood that gave birth to some of the most notorious criminals in American history. Yet, for a young Luciano, this environment didn't just breed criminals, it offered him the tools to achieve something far greater: power. From the moment he set foot in the unforgiving streets, he understood the world through a lens of opportunity, not victimhood. The streets were a ruthless teacher, and Luciano learned its lessons early. He quickly rose through the ranks of the local crime syndicates, not because of his brute strength, but because of his keen intelligence and ability to read people. His eyes were always set on the bigger picture, the broader game, and he knew that only those who could balance loyalty with betrayal would survive. As he entered the world of organized crime, Luciano witnessed firsthand the fractured and chaotic state of the Mafia. Before him, the Mafia was a patchwork of factions, each led by different bosses who fought for dominance. The underworld was rife with infighting, jealousy, and bloodshed. Loyalty was fleeting and alliances were fragile. The mob operated like a loose collection of bands of criminals who fought for power and territory but lacked the structure necessary to control their world. Luciano saw the cracks in this system and began to understand that true power wasn't just about brute force, it was about organization, unity, and the ability to command respect. Luciano's intelligence and strategic mindset set him apart from others. While many of the older, more traditional mafia bosses were content with their methods of extortion and bootlegging, Luciano began to see the world differently. He wasn't interested in building a kingdom based solely on violence and fear. Instead, he wanted to create a criminal empire that operated like a business. He sought efficiency, discipline, and above all, control. He realized that in order to maintain power, you couldn't simply rely on intimidation. You had to have systems in place, leverage connections, and maintain a certain level of sophistication. Luciano understood that crime could be organized like a corporation, a machine that operated with ruthless efficiency, but also with a sense of professionalism. In a way, Luciano's criminal empire was a precursor to the kind of corporate structures that would dominate the world in the coming decades. He was a visionary who saw crime not just as a means to an end but as a way to create wealth, influence, and control. He wasn't just a thug with a gun, he was a businessman with a network, a strategist with an eye on the long game. It was his unique ability to combine violence with organizational genius that made him such a formidable force. But with power came enemies. Luciano's ambition wasn't shared by all, and the alliances he forged throughout his rise were fraught with tension. In the world of the Mafia, trust was rare and betrayal was common. As he climbed higher, the very people who had helped him along the way would eventually become his greatest threats. Luciano's closest allies, like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, would become some of his most loyal supporters. But others, like Vito Genovese and Salvatore Maranzano, would become his bitter rivals. These conflicts would come to a head in a series of bloody wars, with Luciano positioning himself as a master of strategy and manipulation. His ability to outthink his rivals, to form new alliances at just the right moment, made him nearly untouchable for a time. Yet even as Luciano's empire grew, so did the pressure on him. Law enforcement agencies, politicians, and rival mobsters were all closing in on him. The very structure that he had built to create power was now working against him. Betrayals came from within his ranks, and the very system he had created began to crack. His story is not just one of rise and fall but of the tension between holding on to power and letting it slip through your fingers. Power, after all, is always fleeting. The inevitable moment came when Luciano was arrested. The charges were numerous, and the legal system, long corrupt and lenient toward the powerful, was finally catching up with him. The trial that followed became a media circus, a spectacle watched by millions. But despite his best efforts to manipulate the system, Luciano was convicted and sentenced to prison. It was here that the true depth of his character would begin to show. In the confines of a prison cell, far from the streets of New York that had once been his domain, Luciano's power did not diminish. In fact, it expanded. From behind bars, he continued to orchestrate the activities of his criminal empire, proving that his genius wasn't limited to the streets. Even in prison, Luciano remained a force to be reckoned with. As time wore on, Luciano's story became one of legend. His life became a myth, a symbol of what could be achieved through cunning, ambition, and the ability to build something far greater than what anyone could imagine. He was no longer just a gangster. He was the embodiment of the American dream gone awry. A man who had risen from nothing, who had clawed his way to the top of a criminal empire, and who had, in the process, shattered the very moral codes that governed his world. But what does it all mean in the end? Was Luciano's success just a result of his ambition, or was there something deeper at play? His story is a window into the nature of power itself, how it corrupts, how it shapes the lives of those who seek it, and how it ultimately destroys those who chase it too relentlessly. His story asks the question, what is the cost of power? Is it worth the sacrifices, the betrayals, the lies, and the bloodshed that come with it? Luciano's life is a haunting reminder that, in the end, even the most powerful men are not invincible. No empire, no matter how carefully constructed, is immune to the forces of time, betrayal, and fate. And yet, the myth of Luciano lives on, because in the end, it is not just the rise and fall of a man that fascinates us, but the eternal struggle for power itself. In that struggle, we find the echoes of every ambitious person who has ever sought to transcend the limits of their world. It is a story that continues to captivate, not because of the man who lived it, but because of the timeless questions it raises about human nature and the price of ambition. Luciano's journey wasn't just a descent into crime. It was a journey into the very heart of what it means to be human, driven by a desire for control, respect, and ultimately, immortality. Before Luciano's rise to power, the world of organized crime in America was a fractured, chaotic landscape. The underworld was filled with competing factions, each vying for control of the streets, the neighborhoods, and the criminal enterprises that fueled the economy of illicit activities. The Mafia, as it would eventually be known, was far from the unified, streamlined force that we associate with the name today. It was a disjointed system of rival gangs, each with its own ambitions, rules, and codes of conduct. There was no overarching figure who could command respect across all the factions. Crime, though lucrative, was still deeply fragmented, and without leadership, it was vulnerable to both internal and external threats. In this early world, crime was more a survival tactic than a means of empowerment. Each gang or syndicate operated within its own territory, with little regard for the bigger picture. The idea of a mafia, as a single powerful entity, was still in its infancy. Organized crime was chaotic, dangerous, and deeply personal. It wasn't the slick, business-like operation that Luciano would later build, but rather a brutal struggle for dominance in a city where power was everything. The streets of New York were a battleground not just for power but for respect. In this environment, survival was the ultimate goal, and the path to dominance was marked by violence, betrayal, and alliances that shifted as quickly as the tides. At the heart of this chaos was a lack of central leadership. The Mafia was divided along ethnic lines. Italian, Jewish, Irish, and other immigrant groups all had their own criminal organizations, often with deep rivalries between them. The Italian Mafia, though powerful, was not the monolithic force it would become under Luciano's leadership. In fact, it was in a state of constant war with itself, divided into numerous factions with different leaders and agendas. The Sicilian Mafia, for instance, was distinct from the Neapolitan Mafia, and their members often found themselves at odds. These internal divisions weakened their ability to present a unified front against law enforcement or rival gangs. The most prominent leader in the Italian Mafia at the time was Salvatore Maranzano, a man who would play a pivotal role in Luciano's rise to power. Maranzano was a traditionalist, believing that the Mafia should adhere to old-world Sicilian customs and codes. He was a tough, calculated boss who believed in running his organization with an iron fist. However, his approach was outdated and didn't fit the rapidly changing world of the 1920s and 1930s. Maranzano's vision of the Mafia was one rooted in hierarchy and rigid structure, which alienated many younger, more ambitious members of the organization. His failure to adapt to the shifting dynamics of crime in America would ultimately contribute to his downfall. Across the Atlantic, Luciano was already beginning to make his mark. Growing up in the tumultuous environment of New York's Lower East Side, Luciano was not only shaped by the violence and poverty around him, but also by the changing tides of the criminal world. He came of age during the era of Prohibition, a time when alcohol was illegal in the United States, but demand for it was at an all-time high. This was a time of unprecedented opportunity for those who had the means and the connections to exploit the law's blind spots. While many criminals were involved in small-time rackets, Luciano saw the opportunity for something far more ambitious: the creation of an organized, business-like structure that could control the lucrative industries of bootlegging, gambling, and eventually narcotics. Prohibition, in many ways, was the catalyst for the transformation of the Mafia from a disorganized group of petty criminals into a sophisticated, nationwide network of criminal syndicates. The demand for alcohol created a massive underground market, and those who could supply it reaped tremendous profits. But supplying alcohol was just the beginning. The business of crime soon expanded to include other illicit activities like prostitution, drugs, and extortion. Luciano was quick to recognize the potential of these ventures and, even as a young man, began making key alliances with influential figures in the criminal world. This period was marked by a strange mix of old-world tradition and new-world opportunity. The older generation of Mafia bosses, like Maranzano, were steeped in the Sicilian code of honor, which emphasized loyalty, family, and respect. These values had served them well in the old country, but they were ill-suited for the modern, fast-paced world of American crime. The younger generation, represented by figures like Luciano, was more pragmatic. They were not interested in maintaining old-world traditions for the sake of tradition. They wanted power, money, and influence. And to achieve these goals, they were willing to break with convention and form alliances with anyone who could help them gain an advantage. This generational divide would eventually come to a head in the bloody war between Maranzano's faction and the upstart group led by Luciano. The Castellamarese War, as it came to be known, was a brutal conflict that would reshape the Mafia in America and set the stage for Luciano's eventual dominance. The war was fought not only over territory but over the very future of organized crime. Maranzano represented the old guard, clinging to the traditions of the Sicilian Mafia, while Luciano embodied the new, more flexible approach to criminal enterprise. The war was marked by treachery, betrayal, and murder, classic Mafia tactics, but it was also a war of ideas. Maranzano wanted to maintain the status quo, while Luciano sought to modernize the Mafia and turn it into a more efficient, profitable operation. It was during this war that Luciano's true genius began to shine. He understood that in order to win, he needed to not only defeat his enemies but also to unite the fractured elements of the Mafia. He realized that the key to lasting power was not just in fighting his rivals, but in building alliances with them. Luciano began to work behind the scenes, forging secret pacts with Jewish and Irish gangsters, many of whom had long been rivals of the Italian Mafia. His close alliance with Meyer Lansky, a brilliant Jewish gangster with a keen business sense, would prove to be a turning point in the history of organized crime. Together, they formed a powerful partnership that would eventually dominate the world of crime in America. Luciano's ability to see the bigger picture and form strategic alliances set him apart from Maranzano and other Mafia bosses. While Maranzano relied on brute force and intimidation to maintain his power, Luciano used his intelligence, charisma, and strategic thinking to consolidate control. The turning point in the Castellamarese War came when Luciano orchestrated the assassination of Maranzano, eliminating the old guard and clearing the way for his own rise to power. The murder was a calculated move, one that showed Luciano's ruthless side, but it also signified his ability to outthink and outmaneuver his rivals. With Maranzano's death, Luciano emerged as the undisputed boss of the New York Mafia. However, his victory wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a victory for the future of organized crime in America. Luciano's rise marked the beginning of a new era in which the Mafia would evolve from a fragmented, violent collection of gangs into a powerful, well-organized criminal enterprise. This transformation was not just about consolidating power, it was about creating a system that could control vast amounts of wealth and influence across the country. Luciano understood that in order to achieve lasting success, the Mafia needed to operate like a business, with clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and a hierarchy that ensured loyalty and efficiency. At the heart of this transformation was the establishment of the Commission, a governing body that would oversee the activities of the various Mafia families across the country. The Commission was designed to provide a forum for resolving disputes between Mafia families and to ensure that power was distributed in a way that minimized conflict. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to recognize that, by creating a more organized and structured system, he could not only secure his own power but also ensure the long-term survival of the Mafia. Under Luciano's leadership, the Mafia became a well-oiled machine, with each family responsible for specific criminal enterprises. Luciano was no longer just a gangster. He was a mogul, a businessman who understood the importance of maintaining order and control. His empire spanned from New York to Chicago, and his influence reached as far as Hollywood and the labor unions. But this new structure also came with its own challenges. As Luciano's power grew, so did the number of enemies both within and outside of the Mafia. His success made him a target, and the government as well as rival gangsters began to close in. Despite the challenges, Luciano's vision of a unified, business-like Mafia remained intact. His ability to adapt, evolve, and stay several steps ahead of his enemies was what ultimately made him the most powerful and influential gangster in American history. The fragmented world of organized crime that existed before Luciano's rise had been transformed into a cohesive, profitable empire. And while his reign would eventually be cut short by law enforcement, his legacy would live on as a testament to his genius, ambition, and unyielding drive for power. Charles "Lucky" Luciano's journey from a poor immigrant kid to one of the most powerful figures in American organized crime is a tale of ambition, survival, and strategic brilliance. Born in 1897 to Sicilian immigrants, his early life was shaped by the struggles of his family's harsh reality in New York's Lower East Side. This was a time of great poverty, with overcrowded tenements, unsanitary conditions, and a rapidly expanding immigrant population. It was a world where crime was often seen as a legitimate means of survival, and where the rules of the street governed everything. Luciano, like many others in his neighborhood, grew up surrounded by violence, hardship, and an innate understanding that in order to survive, you had to be able to read people, make deals, and most importantly, fight for respect. But even as a child, Luciano was different from most of the other kids. While others followed the familiar paths of petty theft or street brawls, Luciano had a mind that was as sharp as it was ambitious. His early encounters with crime were not born out of the need for quick money or survival but were driven by a desire for something more, a hunger for power, control, and recognition. His intelligence and charisma set him apart from the typical street toughs of his generation. He wasn't just interested in causing trouble for the sake of it. He saw the criminal world as a means to an end, a platform from which he could rise above his circumstances. Luciano didn't just want to be a part of the underworld. He wanted to shape it, control it, and eventually dominate it. As a teenager, Luciano was introduced to the world of organized crime, joining the notorious gang led by the infamous gangster, Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein, a man who would play a crucial role in Luciano's rise, was not just a petty thug but a sophisticated, shrewd businessman with a deep understanding of the intricacies of organized crime. He was the kind of man Luciano aspired to become. Under Rothstein's wing, Luciano quickly learned the finer points of running a criminal enterprise, how to make money, how to avoid the law, and most importantly, how to outmaneuver your enemies. Rothstein taught him that crime, like any business, required strategy, foresight, and above all, patience. For Luciano, this was a revelation. While others in the underworld were focused on short-term gains, Rothstein's influence pushed Luciano to think in the long term. By the time Luciano reached his early 20s, he was already establishing a reputation for himself. He wasn't just another street hustler, he was a young man with a plan. He began to organize his own rackets, focusing on gambling and bootlegging, two of the most profitable illegal enterprises of the time. But it wasn't enough for him to simply run these operations. Luciano understood that to become truly powerful, he had to do more than just control small, scattered enterprises. He needed to consolidate the fractured world of crime into a single, cohesive empire. He began making key alliances with other gangsters in New York City, forging relationships that would form the foundation of his eventual rise to power. One of the pivotal figures in Luciano's early life was Meyer Lansky, a Jewish gangster whose sharp mind and business acumen would complement Luciano's strategic vision. Together, the two men formed a partnership that would shape the future of organized crime. Lansky's ability to handle finances, combined with Luciano's organizational genius and streetwise ruthlessness, made them an unstoppable force. They worked together to expand their operations, taking control of the bootlegging trade and eventually branching out into other areas, including prostitution, narcotics, and labor unions. What set Luciano apart from many of his peers was his understanding that organized crime had to evolve. He saw the underworld as a business that needed to operate with the same level of structure and efficiency as any legitimate corporation. He didn't just want to be the king of the streets, he wanted to be the CEO of a criminal empire. But as Luciano was building his empire, the world around him was changing. The Prohibition era, which had begun in the early 1920s, created a boom in the illegal alcohol trade, giving criminals like Luciano the opportunity to amass huge fortunes. However, Prohibition also brought about fierce competition, and the streets of New York became increasingly violent as rival gangs fought for control of the alcohol trade. This period marked a crucial turning point in Luciano's rise, as he was forced to confront the harsh realities of the criminal world. He realized that to survive in this environment he needed more than just ambition and intelligence. He needed to be ruthless, willing to do whatever it took to eliminate those who stood in his way. This was the beginning of Luciano's transformation from a young, ambitious gangster into a hardened, calculating mastermind. The growing violence of the era culminated in the infamous Castellammare's War, a bloody conflict that would ultimately cement Luciano's reputation as one of the most dangerous and powerful men in the underworld. The war was fought between the rival factions of the Sicilian Mafia, with Luciano aligning himself against Salvatore Maranzano, the reigning boss of bosses. Maranzano represented the old guard of the Mafia, traditional, hierarchical, and conservative in his approach to organized crime. Luciano, on the other hand, embodied the new breed of gangster, forward-thinking, pragmatic, and willing to break with tradition in order to secure power. The war between the two factions was brutal, with both sides employing violence, treachery, and political maneuvering to gain the upper hand. Throughout the war, Luciano demonstrated his genius for strategy and manipulation. He understood that in order to win, he needed not just to defeat his enemies but to eliminate the very system of leadership that kept the Mafia fractured and divided. In a move that would change the course of Mafia history, Luciano orchestrated the assassination of Maranzano, effectively ending the old guard's dominance and paving the way for his own rise to power. With Maranzano's death, Luciano became the undisputed boss of the New York Mafia, and his vision for a unified, business-like criminal enterprise began to take shape. But it wasn't just violence that propelled Luciano to the top, it was his ability to build alliances and create a network of loyal supporters. While Maranzano had relied on traditional Mafia methods of loyalty and respect, Luciano understood the importance of flexibility and pragmatism. He knew that to maintain control over his empire, he had to forge partnerships not just with other Italian criminals but with members of other ethnic groups as well. He formed alliances with Jewish, Irish, and even black gangsters, creating a united front that would eventually control virtually all of New York's illegal enterprises. His ability to bring together such a diverse group of criminals and make them work toward a common goal was a testament to his leadership and organizational skills. Luciano's alliances also extended beyond the world of crime. He understood that in order to maintain power, he had to maintain connections with politicians, law enforcement, and businessmen. He forged relationships with corrupt officials who turned a blind eye to his operations, ensuring that he had the protection and influence needed to keep his empire running smoothly. He also expanded into legitimate business ventures, laundering his criminal profits through hotels, nightclubs, and construction firms. This not only provided a front for his illicit activities but also allowed him to integrate his criminal empire into the broader fabric of American society. By the time Luciano was in his mid-30s, he had accomplished what no one before him had managed to do. He had created a unified, nationwide criminal enterprise that controlled everything from bootlegging to gambling to labor unions. He had transformed the fragmented, chaotic world of organized crime into a well-oiled machine. Luciano was no longer just a gangster. He was a mogul, a businessman who had built an empire from the ground up. His success was not just a testament to his ruthlessness but to his ability to think beyond the confines of street-level crime. Luciano had shown the world that crime could be organized like any other business, and that the key to success was not just in violence, but in strategy, diplomacy, and intelligence. But as Luciano's empire grew, so did the dangers that came with it. Rival gangsters, law enforcement, and even the federal government were closing in on him. Luciano's rise to power had been marked by bloodshed and betrayal, and now the question was whether he could maintain his grip on power in the face of mounting pressure. The world of organized crime, which he had once helped to organize and control, was now beginning to turn against him. His story was far from over, and as Luciano would soon learn, the road to the top was paved with both triumphs and betrayals. The man who had once been a scrappy street kid was now a figure of legend, a symbol of the dangers of ambition, power, and the pursuit of control. But for all his brilliance, the question remained: could Luciano maintain his empire, or would the forces he had once controlled finally catch up with him? As Charles "Lucky" Luciano began to establish himself as the dominant force in the American Mafia, his vision for organized crime evolved beyond the chaotic, disjointed syndicates that had previously ruled New York's underworld. What set Luciano apart from many of his contemporaries was not simply his ruthless ambition, but his realization that in order to achieve lasting power, he needed to restructure the entire criminal enterprise. Instead of the traditional fragmented nature of gang warfare, Luciano sought to create a more organized, business-like model for the Mafia, a model that would be built on efficiency, cooperation, and strategic alliances. His ultimate goal was not just to control a few profitable rackets, but to create an empire that would dominate America's criminal underworld and keep rival factions in check through a system of governance, rather than through endless bloodshed. The first step in his plan was to consolidate power, and Luciano knew that in order to do this, he had to eliminate the deeply entrenched rivalries that plagued the Mafia. Prior to Luciano's rise, the Mafia was a fractured collection of families, each led by different bosses who were often at odds with one another. This fractured system, while occasionally effective, was often inefficient and unstable, leading to constant infighting, betrayal, and unnecessary violence. Luciano understood that in order to exert absolute control, he needed to unite these factions into a single cohesive structure that could operate like a well-oiled machine, efficiently handling illegal enterprises across the country. Luciano's genius was in his ability to forge alliances with powerful figures outside of his immediate circle. Where many Mafia bosses preferred to deal only with their own ethnic group, usually other Italians, Luciano saw the potential for cooperation across ethnic lines. One of the most important relationships he built was with Meyer Lansky, a Jewish gangster who would become one of his closest allies. Lansky, with his sharp mind for business and his connections to Jewish crime syndicates, was instrumental in Luciano's rise to power. Through their partnership, Luciano was able to bring together the often disparate criminal factions of New York, creating a united front that could not be easily toppled. Lansky, who had long been involved in bootlegging and other illicit enterprises, understood the importance of turning crime into a business, and his financial expertise complemented Luciano's strategic vision. Together, they created a partnership that bridged ethnic divides and built the foundation of a nationwide criminal empire. But Luciano didn't stop at simply uniting New York's criminal families. He knew that in order to establish a true empire, he had to extend his reach beyond the city and into other major hubs of organized crime. Luciano's ability to form alliances with rival gangs in other parts of the country helped solidify his position as the true boss of American organized crime. His reach expanded to cities like Chicago, where he forged relationships with powerful figures like Al Capone, and even out west to Hollywood, where Luciano's influence spread into the entertainment industry. His success was not just about running illegal businesses but about gaining control over every aspect of the criminal world, from gambling and narcotics to labor unions and even the docks. Luciano's vision was a nationwide empire that could operate seamlessly, with each family having a clear role in the broader structure, yet bound by a shared goal of profit and survival. Perhaps Luciano's most important strategic move came in 1931, when he helped establish the Commission, a governing body designed to bring order to the chaotic world of organized crime. Before this, the Mafia had been governed by a loose set of rules, with each family operating independently and often clashing with others over territory and influence. The Commission was designed to act as a ruling council for all the major Mafia families in America, where each family's boss would have a voice in the direction of the organization as a whole. This body helped to mitigate conflicts and disputes between rival families, giving each boss an opportunity to resolve conflicts diplomatically rather than through violence. Luciano's creation of the Commission was revolutionary. It was a system that mirrored the structure of legitimate corporations, with a central leadership body that could help prevent chaos and stabilize the Mafia's operations. It was also a reflection of Luciano's broader understanding of power. He recognized that in order to maintain control, he needed to create a system that was both effective and sustainable. The establishment of the commission marked the beginning of Luciano's golden age. With the Mafia now operating as a unified entity, Luciano could focus on expanding and consolidating his criminal empire. His control over the bootlegging business alone was enough to give him immense wealth and influence, but Luciano was not content with merely running one profitable racket. He expanded his operations into a variety of illegal enterprises, including gambling, narcotics, and prostitution. His strategic alliances allowed him to maintain dominance over these industries, ensuring that his wealth and power continued to grow. He also expanded into legitimate businesses, using them as fronts to launder the profits from his criminal activities. Luciano's criminal empire became as much a network of legitimate businesses as it was a web of illegal enterprises, and his ability to maintain these dual operations helped him avoid suspicion from law enforcement. Luciano's methodical, business-like approach to crime also extended to how he managed his relationships with the men beneath him. He understood that loyalty was essential to maintaining control, and he knew how to reward loyalty and punish betrayal. His relationships with his underbosses, lieutenants, and capos were carefully constructed, ensuring that each man had a vested interest in maintaining the stability of the empire. Luciano also recognized the value of keeping a low profile, avoiding the public spectacle that had often marked the reigns of previous mafia bosses. Unlike figures like Al Capone, who reveled in the spotlight and the media attention that came with it, Luciano was far more cautious, understanding that staying under the radar was key to his continued success. He avoided the high-profile showdowns and public confrontations that had defined the careers of his rivals, preferring instead to operate in the shadows, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Even as Luciano's influence expanded, he faced growing pressure from law enforcement, politicians, and rival gangsters who began to see him as a threat to their own power. The public perception of organized crime in America was changing, and the government began to crack down on the Mafia in a way that had never been seen before. Luciano's ability to outmaneuver his enemies and adapt to the changing landscape was key to his survival. He recognized that in order to maintain control, he had to stay several steps ahead of both the law and his rivals, using his vast network of contacts to protect himself and his operations. One of the ways Luciano managed to avoid capture by law enforcement was through the manipulation of corrupt officials. He understood that politics and law enforcement were just as much a part of the game as crime itself. Luciano cultivated relationships with politicians and police officers, ensuring that his criminal operations could continue without interference. He used his wealth and influence to buy protection, bribing officials and law enforcement officers to turn a blind eye to his activities. This level of political sophistication allowed him to operate with relative impunity, and it was a key factor in his ability to maintain his criminal empire for as long as he did. But as Luciano's empire grew, so too did the threats against him. Rival factions within the Mafia began to see him as a threat to their own power, and the very system that Luciano had created to bring order to the underworld began to show signs of strain. The commission, which had been designed to prevent conflict, now became a battleground for control. As Luciano's power grew, so did the number of enemies who sought to undermine him. Even some of his closest allies, like Vito Genovese, began to plot against him, seeking to take control of Luciano's empire for themselves. The world of organized crime, despite all of Luciano's efforts to structure it, remained as treacherous and unpredictable as ever. Through all of this, Luciano remained a master of strategy, adapting to the ever-changing landscape of organized crime. His ability to balance loyalty and betrayal, power and diplomacy, was what allowed him to maintain control for as long as he did. But as the threats against him grew more intense, Luciano's empire began to show signs of cracking. The very system he had created to bring order to the Mafia also made him a target, and the political pressure and rivalries within the underworld eventually caught up with him. The rise of federal law enforcement, along with growing tensions within his own ranks, foreshadowed the eventual fall of Luciano's empire. His reign, though highly successful, would not last forever, and the forces that had once worked in his favor would soon begin to close in on him. Luciano's story is a testament to the power of vision, intelligence, and ruthlessness. His transformation of the Mafia from a fragmented collection of gangs into a unified, business-like empire is a monumental achievement in the history of organized crime. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a visionary who understood that crime, like any business, needed to be organized and managed with care. Through strategic alliances, innovative thinking, and a firm hand, Luciano built an empire that reshaped the criminal world and set the stage for future generations of gangsters. But in the end, Even the most carefully constructed empires are vulnerable to the forces of time, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of power. Luciano's empire would eventually fall, but the legacy of his reign would shape the Mafia for decades to come. In the world of organized crime, there exists a code that binds its members together, a code that demands loyalty, silence, and above all, respect. This code, often referred to as omerta, is the cornerstone upon which the Mafia built its empire. Omerta, an unwritten set of rules, is not merely a set of principles. It is a way of life, a belief system that governs the relationships between mobsters, their families, and their dealings in the world of crime. It is the philosophy that shaped the very structure of the Mafia and the conduct of its members, and in many ways, it was the key to the survival and success of organized crime in America. But while omerta was a symbol of loyalty and unity, it was also the source of deep contradictions, conflicting forces of trust and betrayal that would define the fate of many in the criminal underworld. The essence of omerta is simple: silence in the face of law enforcement, loyalty to the family, and unyielding respect for authority. This code of conduct dictated that a Mafia member must never cooperate with law enforcement, never testify against another member of the organization, and never reveal the inner workings of the Mafia to the outside world. It was a pact that ensured the survival of the criminal syndicates, protecting their operations from the prying eyes of the authorities. To break the code was to commit the ultimate betrayal, one that often resulted in the harshest of punishments. In a world where betrayal could mean death, omerta was a powerful weapon, both a shield and a sword. Omerta created a world where loyalty was paramount. It built a structure of trust that allowed Mafia families to operate with a level of cohesion and unity that other criminal organizations simply could not match. Members of the Mafia were bound not only by business interests but by the unspoken bond of mutual respect and loyalty. A sense of fraternity existed between the mobsters, a code of brotherhood that extended far beyond the professional world of crime. The families were not just groups of individuals working together for profit. They were communities, built on the shared understanding of their obligations to one another. At its core, omerta also operated as a tool of control. The Mafia bosses, like Luciano, understood that in order to maintain power, they had to ensure that their subordinates followed the code to the letter. A violation of omerta could result in severe consequences, not just for the individual who broke the code but for the family as a whole. The Mafia could not afford to let disloyalty or the spilling of secrets compromise its operations. The very success of the Mafia depended on the absolute silence and loyalty of its members, and anyone who threatened this balance was swiftly dealt with. Betrayal was not tolerated, and the punishment for breaking omerta was always severe. The unspoken rule was that once you entered the world of the Mafia, there was no turning back. Those who tried to break the code or cooperate with authorities were seen as traitors, and traitors were dealt with swiftly and without mercy. The importance of omerta was also tied to the psychological and emotional dynamics within the Mafia. The underworld was a world of constant tension, where every man was expected to watch his back, aware that his survival often depended on his ability to maintain loyalty within the ranks. The fear of betrayal was ever present, and it created a system where even the closest of allies could turn on one another if there was a perceived threat. This constant fear of betrayal led to a culture of secrecy and distrust, where loyalty was prized above all else. Mafia members were expected to keep their dealings secret, even from their own families, and the lines between the personal and the professional often became blurred. It wasn't uncommon for Mafia bosses to keep their criminal activities hidden from their wives, children, or even their closest friends. Trust was something that had to be earned and constantly maintained, and any sign of weakness could lead to an individual's downfall. This culture of silence and loyalty was crucial to the success of the Mafia's operations. In the face of growing pressure from law enforcement and rival criminal organizations, the Code of Omerta allowed the Mafia to remain a relatively closed system. The authorities had difficulty infiltrating Mafia operations because few members were willing to speak, and those who did were often subjected to brutal retribution. The code created an impenetrable wall of silence around the Mafia, making it difficult for the police or the FBI to gather intelligence or build strong cases against the crime families. For decades, the Mafia thrived in this environment of secrecy, with its members enjoying a degree of protection from the law. The code ensured that the Mafia could operate with a sense of invincibility, creating a layer of psychological security for its members. But Omerta wasn't just about secrecy, it was also about respect. Respect within the Mafia was earned through actions, loyalty, and the ability to command fear and admiration from those around you. In the Mafia world, respect was everything. A boss who could command respect was able to keep his family loyal and under control, ensuring that his power remained unchallenged. Respect was not just given freely, it had to be earned through years of service and by demonstrating strength, intelligence, and a willingness to do whatever it took to protect the family. The Mafia had its own system of checks and balances. Those who showed disrespect for the code, for the boss, or for their fellow members could be punished, sometimes violently, for their transgressions. Respect was a currency in the world of organized crime, and it was a currency that could be easily lost. In Luciano's case, respect was one of the cornerstones of his leadership. He was not only a brilliant strategist and an ambitious criminal mastermind, he was also a figure who commanded the respect of his peers and subordinates alike. Luciano knew how to walk the fine line between fear and loyalty. He understood that in order to lead, he had to maintain a sense of authority that was unquestionable. His leadership was built on a foundation of respect, both for the code of Omerta and for the men who followed him. He was known for his ability to make difficult decisions, to take calculated risks, and to maintain a calm and collected demeanor in the face of danger. These qualities earned him the respect of even the most hardened gangsters, and it allowed him to build an empire that was unmatched in its scope and efficiency. The enforcement of Omerta, however, wasn't always as clear-cut as it seemed. While the code of silence was the official rule, in practice, it was often subject to interpretation. There were times when members of the Mafia would violate the code, either out of fear, greed, or necessity. The pressure to maintain loyalty was immense, and the consequences of disloyalty were severe. This created a paradox where, on the one hand, the Mafia demanded absolute loyalty, but on the other hand, there were occasions when that loyalty was tested, either through betrayal or necessity. This created a constant tension within the ranks, as mobsters had to navigate the complicated dynamics of loyalty, fear, and self-preservation. In Luciano's own rise to power, we see the complex interplay between loyalty and betrayal. He was not above using betrayal as a strategic tool, especially when it came to eliminating rivals or solidifying his control. His role in the murder of Salvatore Maranzano, the boss of the Castellamarese faction, is a perfect example of this. Maranzano represented the old guard of the Mafia, a traditionalist who clung to the old ways of running the underworld. Luciano, on the other hand, was a forward thinker, a man who understood that the Mafia needed to adapt in order to survive. His decision to have Maranzano killed was not just an act of personal ambition, it was a calculated move to bring the Mafia into the modern era, and it was done with a cold, clinical adherence to the code of power and respect. Luciano's ability to maneuver in such a cutthroat world without violating the unspoken rules of Omerta set him apart as a leader and master tactician. Yet, as Luciano's power grew, the very system of loyalty and secrecy he built began to work against him. The pressure of maintaining control, managing alliances, and keeping everyone in line was immense. The code of Omerta was not foolproof, and as the criminal empire expanded, the risk of betrayal grew exponentially. Those who felt slighted or ignored might seek revenge, and the dangers of disloyalty always loomed. The story of Omerta, while built on loyalty and respect, is also one of human nature's darker instincts: greed, envy, and the inevitability of betrayal. Even the most powerful figures like Luciano were never completely insulated from the forces of mistrust and rivalry that the code itself could not entirely prevent. In the end, Omerta is more than just a Mafia code. It is a lens through which the power dynamics, emotional complexities, and psychological tolls of organized crime can be understood. It is a system that elevates loyalty and silence to a higher moral plane, while simultaneously creating a world where betrayal and violence are constant threats. It is a code that binds the Mafia together, even as it drives its members apart. It is a system that Luciano mastered, shaping it into a tool of both control and survival. But Omerta also carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Because in the end, loyalty and respect are fragile things, and even the most loyal of men can be undone by the harsh realities of the world they inhabit. Luciano's ability to build a criminal empire was not just a product of his ruthless ambition or his keen strategic mind. It was also a result of his profound understanding of how to turn crime into a business. Unlike many of his peers who were content with operating small-scale rackets that brought in quick, albeit limited, profits, Luciano saw the potential for organized crime to function much like any legitimate corporation, one that could generate vast wealth through an intricate web of operations, all managed under a central authority. To him, crime was a business, and like any business, it required careful management, a clear organizational structure, and an eye for long-term profitability. This was a revolutionary shift in how the Mafia operated, and it set Luciano apart as a true visionary in the world of organized crime. When Luciano took control of the New York Mafia, he didn't just inherit a fragmented network of crime families. He inherited a broken system, one where rivalries ran deep and the Mafia's operations were disjointed, often uncoordinated, and ultimately inefficient. Luciano's first order of business was to bring order to this chaos. He recognized that the Mafia could no longer afford to operate like a collection of independent gangs. The criminal underworld, in his eyes, needed a structured, corporate-like system. One where resources were pooled, operations were streamlined, and loyalty was not just a personal virtue but a business necessity. One of the key areas Luciano focused on was the monopolization of certain industries, particularly those that were most profitable in the era. Bootlegging, which was thriving during the Prohibition period, became the centerpiece of Luciano's criminal operations. The prohibition of alcohol in the United States created an insatiable demand for illegal alcohol, and it was the perfect opportunity for organized crime to thrive. But Luciano wasn't interested in simply cornering a small piece of the market. He aimed to control the entire industry. Instead of allowing individual families or street-level gangsters to operate independently, he centralized control of the bootlegging trade, taking full charge of the alcohol supply chain from production to distribution. By centralizing the bootlegging business, Luciano was able to maximize profits and minimize competition. He negotiated deals with distilleries, breweries, and distributors, and created a network of transport routes that allowed his organization to move alcohol across state lines and into major cities with relative ease. He also cut out the middlemen, giving himself direct access to the profits that would have otherwise gone to smaller, independent operators. This consolidation allowed Luciano to create a more predictable, reliable revenue stream, one that could fund his growing empire and pay for the protection of his operations. In doing so, he proved that crime could be organized in a way that was not only profitable but also efficient. But bootlegging was just one part of Luciano's broader vision for his criminal empire. While alcohol may have been the golden goose of the Prohibition era, Luciano understood that the true power of organized crime lay in its ability to diversify and control a wide range of illicit industries. Gambling, which had long been a staple of the underworld, was another area where Luciano sought to establish dominance. He recognized that gambling, like bootlegging, was a highly profitable business with enormous potential for expansion. Instead of allowing individual racketeers to control gambling operations in their respective territories, Luciano worked to consolidate the gambling market into a unified operation. Whether it was illegal casinos, numbers rackets, or sports betting, Luciano controlled every aspect of the gambling business in New York City, eventually extending his reach across the country. Luciano's approach to gambling mirrored his tactics with bootlegging. He eliminated smaller operators by forcing them to pay for protection or by incorporating them into his operation. He negotiated with corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials, securing the kind of protection that allowed his gambling empire to flourish without interference. As with his bootlegging operations, Luciano kept a tight grip on the financial side of things, ensuring that profits from gambling were funneled through his various fronts, including legitimate businesses like nightclubs, restaurants, and hotels. This integration of illicit and legitimate businesses was another key aspect of Luciano's approach to organized crime. By running both types of enterprises, he was able to launder the money from his criminal activities, giving his organization a veneer of legitimacy while maintaining a firm hold on illegal profits. The control of labor unions was another critical aspect of Luciano's business model. The labor unions were an essential part of the American economy, and Luciano understood that by gaining control of the unions, he could not only increase his financial power but also extend his influence over large swaths of the workforce. Through his connections with union leaders and corrupt politicians, Luciano began to infiltrate key industries, particularly in construction, transportation, and docks. He manipulated union contracts and workers' wages, using his control over the labor force to extort businesses for money and gain political leverage. The unions were also a key source of manpower for Luciano's various illegal operations, providing muscle for his protection rackets and giving him leverage over competing criminal organizations. Luciano's business-savvy approach to crime extended beyond just the obvious money-making enterprises. He was also deeply involved in the management of his criminal empire's human resources. He understood that in order for his business to run smoothly, he had to keep his men loyal, organized, and motivated. Luciano was a master at balancing his relationship with his underlings, ensuring that the key players in his organization were well rewarded and well taken care of. He didn't just rely on fear to maintain control, he also fostered a sense of loyalty and camaraderie within his ranks. In exchange for loyalty and hard work, Luciano rewarded his trusted men with a share of the profits from the various rackets. Those who proved their worth within the organization could rise through the ranks, earning respect and status within the criminal world. This system of rewards and punishments was a hallmark of Luciano's approach to running his criminal empire. He was not just a ruthless mob boss but also a manager, ensuring that his men were incentivized to follow the rules and maintain the order of the organization. At the same time, those who stepped out of line or betrayed the family faced severe consequences. Loyalty was a non-negotiable element in Luciano's empire, and he maintained strict discipline within the ranks. While other bosses relied on brute force and fear to control their organizations, Luciano understood that loyalty could be just as powerful a tool for ensuring the success of his operations. By fostering a sense of family and community, he was able to create a more cohesive, efficient and loyal organization that could withstand the pressures of law enforcement and rival gangs. Luciano's empire was not just a series of criminal operations, however. It was a tightly coordinated system that stretched across the country, with Luciano at the center of it all. His influence extended from the streets of New York to the beaches of Florida, from the casinos of Nevada to the docks of California. He worked with other powerful figures in the criminal world, forging alliances with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, as well as Irish and black criminals, in order to create a vast network that could dominate the criminal world. He understood that the key to success was cooperation, not just competition. By forming alliances with powerful figures from different ethnic groups, Luciano ensured that his empire was well-rounded and capable of withstanding the pressures of both law enforcement and rival factions within the underworld. The growth of Luciano's empire was not just a reflection of his business acumen but also a testament to his ability to adapt to changing circumstances. As the world around him evolved, so too did his methods. He was not content to rest on his laurels or cling to outdated methods of operation. Instead, he was constantly looking for new ways to expand his influence, whether it was through new criminal enterprises, new alliances, or new methods of laundering money. Luciano was a forward-thinking boss who understood that in the world of organized crime, staying ahead of the game was key to survival. Through his innovative approach to crime, Luciano transformed the Mafia from a loose collection of gangsters into a sophisticated, nationwide organization that operated like a corporation. His ability to treat crime as a business, his focus on efficiency, and his mastery of both human and financial resources made him one of the most powerful figures in American organized crime. His empire became the model for future generations of mobsters, and his legacy as a businessman and criminal mastermind would influence the Mafia for decades to come. But like all great empires, Luciano's would eventually crumble under the weight of its own success. The more power he accumulated, the more enemies he made, and the more vulnerable he became to the forces of law and order that sought to tear his empire apart. Still, the manner in which Luciano built his criminal empire remains one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of organized crime, a testament to his vision, his intelligence, and his unyielding desire to dominate the underworld. As Luciano's empire expanded, so too did the complexity of the world in which he operated. The rise of his power didn't just elevate him to a position of unrivaled authority within the Mafia, it also placed him squarely in the path of rivals and enemies, both within the underworld and beyond. For a man like Luciano, who built his empire on ruthless calculation and strategic alliances, the balance of power was as fragile as it was valuable. He was no longer simply managing a network of criminal enterprises, he was navigating a world rife with threats from every direction. The line between ally and enemy grew thinner with every move he made. With his success came the inevitable consequence: jealousy, envy, and an ever-growing pool of individuals who wanted to take him down. Rival factions within the Mafia were constantly eyeing Luciano's growing influence, and many saw his centralized control as a direct challenge to their own power. Before Luciano, the Mafia was a world of fragmented territories, where different families controlled their respective zones with little interference from one another. However, Luciano's vision of unity through control, epitomized by his creation of the Commission, fundamentally shifted the underworld power structure. The establishment of the Commission was not merely a mechanism for preventing conflict. It was an audacious consolidation of power that positioned Luciano at the top of a vast criminal empire. While the Commission served to mitigate violence between families, it also created friction. Older mobsters, particularly those loyal to the more traditional methods of running things, viewed Luciano's rise with increasing unease. The most immediate rival to Luciano's power came from within his own ranks. Vito Genovese, a powerful capo who had once been one of Luciano's trusted lieutenants, began to see Luciano's success not as a shared victory but as an opportunity to further his own ambitions. Genovese had long harbored desires for greater power, and the ascension of Luciano to the role of boss created a sense of dissatisfaction among men like him who believed they deserved to be at the helm. Genovese's discontent was rooted in both personal and professional grievances. On a personal level, he had always seen himself as one of the most capable and ambitious figures in the Mafia, and Luciano's consolidation of power left him feeling marginalized. Professionally, he felt that Luciano's control over the commission and the broader structure of the Mafia took away his ability to act with the kind of autonomy he desired. This internal discord between Luciano and his own men would become one of the first major cracks in his seemingly impenetrable empire. But the enemies that Luciano faced weren't just confined to those who operated within the underworld's familiar circles. The legal system, too, had begun to take notice of his activities, and with it, the increasing pressure from law enforcement became an ever-present shadow. The federal government, having initially turned a blind eye to the criminal activities of the Mafia, began to ramp up its efforts to root out organized crime. The FBI, with its burgeoning commitment to taking down figures like Luciano, began investigating his operations. The media, once enamored with the allure of mobsters, began to turn against Luciano as his power became impossible to ignore. The press portrayed him not just as a criminal mastermind, but as the face of a larger, systemic problem. The Mafia had transcended the world of petty thievery and become an organized, dangerous force capable of influencing the political and economic systems of the United States. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's obsession with taking down figures like Luciano intensified as the Mafia's operations spread further into legitimate industries. His influence had become so pervasive that it wasn't just the world of crime that was under scrutiny. Entire sectors of society were now suspected of being under his control. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies began investigating his ties to legitimate businesses, gambling rings, and labor unions, suspecting that his empire was not merely based in illegal activities but had extended into various levels of American society. The depth of Luciano's control over industries like the docks, where labor unions were heavily influenced by his criminal connections, was not just a law enforcement concern but a political one. The stakes were much higher, and Luciano's position had begun to attract serious attention from those in power who felt that something needed to be done to put an end to his criminal enterprise. Amid these external pressures, Luciano's relationships with other criminal figures also began to deteriorate. While the alliances he had forged with men like Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and others had initially served to strengthen his power, they also exposed him to the unpredictable nature of mob politics. There was always the possibility that one of his allies might betray him if it meant a greater share of power. Even as Luciano worked to unite the fractured Mafia under the banner of the Commission, he had to contend with the reality that loyalty in the criminal world is often as fleeting as power itself. The very structure that had enabled him to rise was now creating the conditions for a potential downfall. For Luciano, these tensions were a constant reminder that in the world of organized crime, power is never fully secure. Despite his genius for consolidation, he could never eliminate the risks posed by rival gangsters, disloyal associates, and law enforcement. The very mechanisms he had put in place to prevent conflicts, such as the Commission, were beginning to breed discontent. The power dynamics that governed the Mafia were fragile, and any shift in the balance could have serious consequences. With enemies both inside and outside of his organization, Luciano had to navigate a treacherous landscape, one where betrayal, violence, and the shifting tides of power were constant threats. The delicate equilibrium that Luciano had worked so hard to establish was further tested when Salvatore Maranzano, a rival Mafia boss, came into the picture. Maranzano, a leading figure in the Castellamarese faction, had long been a thorn in Luciano's side. Maranzano was a traditionalist, a mobster who believed in old-school Mafia principles, where power was defined by territorial control and the maintenance of strict hierarchies within families. Luciano, however, had a different vision for the Mafia, one that prioritized unity over factionalism and that sought to extend its influence beyond the confines of the old ways. The conflict between the two men was inevitable. Luciano knew that in order to solidify his power and ensure the longevity of his empire, he would have to eliminate Maranzano. This culminated in the violent and dramatic downfall of Maranzano, a turning point in Luciano's rise to the pinnacle of Mafia power. Maranzano's death, orchestrated by Luciano with the help of his trusted associates, marked the end of an era in the Mafia. It signaled that the days of old-school Mafia practices were numbered, and that a new kind of criminal leadership was emerging. One that was more pragmatic, more strategic, and more willing to use violence to achieve its ends. Luciano's success in eliminating Maranzano was not just a personal victory, it was a victory for the new world order of organized crime that he had been building. By orchestrating this coup, Luciano secured his place at the head of the commission and solidified his control over the Mafia. The shift in power, however, did not come without consequences. Maranzano's death set off a chain of events that further polarized the Mafia, creating deep rifts among those who had been loyal to the old guard and those who supported Luciano's vision. As Luciano's enemies continued to multiply, both within his own organization and from rival gangs, he faced an ever-growing set of challenges. Rival families were constantly plotting against him, hoping to wrest control of his territories and operations. Even as he worked to eliminate his direct competitors, Luciano had to manage a delicate web of alliances with other gangsters, each of whom had their own ambitions and agendas. His ability to navigate this treacherous political landscape was a testament to his mastery of strategy. He knew that in the world of organized crime, the key to survival was not just power, but the ability to maintain control over the factions vying for influence. Throughout it all, Luciano's ability to keep his enemies at bay was a combination of intelligence, fear, and manipulation. He knew when to negotiate and when to strike, when to reinforce alliances and when to sever ties. His ability to anticipate the moves of his rivals and to stay several steps ahead was what allowed him to maintain dominance over the criminal underworld for as long as he did. However, as his empire continued to grow, so did the risks. The more territory Luciano controlled, the more enemies he made. The more powerful he became, the more visible he became, and the more likely it was that the law, and the people trying to take him down, would eventually close in. The tension between loyalty and betrayal, trust and suspicion, formed the backdrop of Luciano's reign. As his empire expanded, so too did the forces that sought to undo it. The Mafia, in its very nature, was a world of shifting allegiances, constant backstabbing, and the brutal reality of survival at any cost. For Luciano, the question was never just about staying on top, it was about knowing how to play the game, how to keep his enemies guessing, and how to hold on to power in a world that seemed designed to pull down even the most powerful figures. His empire was built on a foundation of cunning, betrayal, and loyalty, a balancing act that he performed with unmatched skill. But as history would show, no empire, no matter how carefully constructed, is ever truly immune to the forces that ultimately tear them down. The underworld in which Luciano thrived was not only a realm of street-level criminals and street-corner deals, but one embroiled in a far more complex set of tensions. As his influence expanded and his power grew, Luciano was forced to navigate a landscape where violence was always a possible currency, but not always the preferred one. His intelligence and strategic mindset had allowed him to build an empire based on organization, but this very success made him a target for those who sought to topple him, as well as law enforcement agencies that were determined to break the grip of the Mafia on the American public. The Mafia, with its decades of ruthless history, was now facing increased governmental pressure, and the looming threat of law enforcement would come to define the latter half of Luciano's reign. While Luciano had built his empire on a foundation of loyalty, cunning, and calculated violence, it was clear that the game was changing. His rise had coincided with a period in which organized crime was beginning to draw attention not only from local police but from federal agencies like the FBI. The increasing crackdown on organized crime, particularly after the massive expansion of the Mafia into legitimate businesses and labor unions, signaled a shift in the way criminals would need to operate. The stakes had grown and the methods of survival had to evolve. The authorities were no longer willing to look the other way, as they had done during the earlier years of Prohibition when the Mafia was merely a convenient but dangerous outgrowth of American vice. Luciano's power was now at its peak, but the higher the Mafia rose, the more its enemies multiplied. Rival gangs began to view him not just as a powerful criminal figure, but as an insurmountable obstacle. For them, the rise of Luciano represented a new type of order in the criminal world, one that didn't leave room for their own ambitions. But his greatest adversaries were not the rival mobsters. They were the forces of law and order that were finally beginning to coalesce against him. The FBI, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, had made the fight against organized crime one of their top priorities. Their primary goal was not just to arrest criminals but to dismantle the vast networks that Luciano had so carefully built. In the years following Luciano's rise, law enforcement efforts increased dramatically. Agents began to piece together the extent of Luciano's operations, investigating his connections to corrupt politicians, union leaders, and even public officials. The Mafia's ties to the American labor movement were of particular concern, as they undermined the very principles upon which legitimate industry was supposed to be built. The union-controlled labor strikes, which were often used as leverage for mob-controlled businesses, drew the ire of lawmakers and the public. What had once been a behind-the-scenes, largely ignored phenomenon was now under the spotlight, and this brought an entirely new set of challenges. Throughout these growing tensions, Luciano had to adapt quickly. His network of loyal enforcers and high-level associates helped him maintain control over the most crucial aspects of his business, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to keep the cracks from showing. While the commission he'd founded was meant to ensure a unified, strategic approach to the Mafia's operations, the reality was that rivalries continued to simmer beneath the surface. Although Luciano's business model was more sophisticated than those of his competitors, he was not immune to the infighting and betrayals that seemed to be a constant feature of the criminal underworld. This period of tension within his own ranks became one of the most critical aspects of Luciano's career. There were constant challenges to his leadership, particularly from those who felt that his strategies were too ambitious, too public, or too far removed from the gritty street-level operations that they knew best. These rivalries came to a head with the rising threat of law enforcement, particularly with the FBI beginning to turn up the heat. To survive in this increasingly hostile environment, Luciano had to rely on not just his street knowledge and power, but also his intelligence network, his connections with influential politicians, and his ability to keep his men in line. The internal pressures were as dangerous as the external ones. Despite the internal and external threats, Luciano's ability to survive during this time speaks to the brilliance of his strategic vision. He may have been a target, but he was also a master of survival. His ability to turn challenges into opportunities, whether it was through alliances, strategic concessions, or simply outlasting his enemies, was a testament to his leadership. Even as rival factions within his organization plotted against him, Luciano was able to remain in control through careful manipulation of the forces at play. He knew who to trust, who to keep at arm's length, and when to strike. His ability to play the long game, staying ahead of his competitors and the law, was one of the key factors that allowed him to stay at the top for so long. However, Luciano's empire was not without its flaws. In trying to build a lasting criminal organization, he had made the mistake of underestimating how deep the corruption went within his own ranks. While he had strategically maneuvered to eliminate many of his competitors, he had failed to anticipate the volatility within his own organization, especially with men who felt they had been wronged by his centralization of power. As the pressure of law enforcement continued to mount, some of those closest to Luciano began to question whether his vision for the Mafia was worth the escalating risk. His own men, once loyal and united, were starting to become divided. The tension between loyalty and betrayal would ultimately come to define Luciano's downfall. While the commission was supposed to stabilize the Mafia and prevent unnecessary infighting, it also created a structure that was difficult to maintain. Once Luciano had built the framework for organized crime, it became clear that his competitors and those dissatisfied with his methods would work within the very system he'd created to undermine his authority. As the Mafia expanded into new markets, the question of who controlled what, and for how long, became increasingly contentious. A fight over territory, respect, and money was always at the core of Mafia power struggles. These battles, often fought in the shadows, were becoming harder to control, especially as new law enforcement techniques and the FBI's growing interest in organized crime threatened to expose the entire structure. Meanwhile, the government was building cases against Luciano. Federal agents, backed by new laws and the growing ability to use wiretaps and surveillance, were closing in on Luciano's operations. Their main target was his involvement in illegal gambling, bootlegging, and his control over the docks. But the government's ability to make charges stick was still far from certain. One of the strengths of the Mafia, especially under Luciano's leadership, was the meticulous secrecy with which it operated. Luciano had established systems of loyalty and silence, which kept his men in line and protected the operations from law enforcement. But even the best-laid plans could be undone by a single betrayal. The government's efforts to capture Luciano came to a head when he was eventually arrested on charges of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The FBI's efforts were successful because they were able to build a case through wiretaps, bribed informants, and the eventual cooperation of individuals within his circle. While Luciano had managed to stay ahead of law enforcement for many years, the growing pressure and the increasingly sophisticated methods used to infiltrate his organization meant that no matter how many precautions he took, his empire was eventually going to face collapse. His arrest marked the beginning of the end for the powerful empire he had built, as it was a stark reminder that even the most strategic minds in the criminal world could not escape the relentless pursuit of justice. In the aftermath of his arrest, the internal fractures in Luciano's empire were made even clearer. His top lieutenants and closest associates, many of whom had once sworn eternal loyalty to him, now found themselves exposed. The very men he had trusted, men who had risen through the ranks of his organization, were beginning to distance themselves from him in a desperate attempt to save their own skins. Betrayal, a theme that had always loomed large in the Mafia world, now became a practical reality. But even from behind bars, Luciano's influence continued to be felt. His name still carried weight, and his vision for organized crime remained ingrained in the way the Mafia operated. He had built an empire that was too powerful to be completely dismantled by a single arrest, and in the wake of his imprisonment, many of the operations he had established continued under new leadership. His power might have been temporarily curtailed, but the very systems and strategies he had put in place ensured that the legacy of his empire endured. Luciano's survival and eventual deportation marked the end of one chapter in the story of organized crime, but also the beginning of a new era.
His fall was not just a loss of power. It was the moment when the Mafia, despite its violent and treacherous nature, began to shift its focus. His story would resonate for years, not just as a tale of rise and fall, but as a testament to the complex dynamics between power, loyalty, and betrayal. The day that marked the beginning of Luciano's downfall was not merely a fleeting moment of failure. It was the culmination of years of calculated moves, rising tensions, and internal shifts within his empire. Despite his brilliance in navigating the underworld, no one, least of all Luciano, could escape the relentless march of time and law enforcement. The arrest of Lucky Luciano did not come as a surprise to him, nor was it a simple matter of the police catching a criminal. It was a complex web of betrayal, governmental pressure, and the inevitable reckoning for a man who had, until that moment, managed to stay several steps ahead of everyone who sought to bring him down. But even the most powerful figures must eventually face the consequences of their actions, and Luciano's time had come. The cracks in Luciano's empire had begun to show long before his arrest. The strain between his vision of a unified mafia and the old-school power structures, combined with growing tensions within his ranks, had left him vulnerable. Rival factions within the Mafia were increasingly at odds with Luciano's centralization of power. His attempts to solidify control through the commission had created more enemies than allies, and while he had made alliances with other criminal bosses and key figures in the underworld, there were always those who saw him as an upstart, an interloper who had disrupted the natural order of Mafia rule. Even as he expanded his criminal empire, gaining power and wealth beyond what anyone had thought possible, these rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the outside world was closing in on him. Law enforcement, particularly the FBI, had been quietly building a case against Luciano for years. His involvement in gambling, labor racketeering, and his ties to corrupt politicians had made him a high-profile target for the federal government. The Mafia, with its vast reach and unchecked power, was seen as a national threat. Luciano's involvement in bootlegging and the control of major labor unions had long been known, but with the increasing sophistication of investigative techniques like wiretapping, surveillance, and the growing ability of federal agents to infiltrate criminal networks, Luciano's time was running out. His empire, so carefully built on secrecy and loyalty, was beginning to unravel, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. Luciano's arrest was not a result of a single misstep, but of a series of events that ultimately led to his capture. One of the most significant factors in his downfall was the role of informants. In the world of organized crime, loyalty is both a currency and a weapon. But loyalty can be a fragile thing, and even the most trusted men can break under pressure. Luciano's rise had been aided by his ability to maintain control over his men, but as law enforcement's efforts grew more intense, his associates began to feel the heat. They knew that the consequences of getting caught could be severe: prison time, violence, or even death. For some, cooperating with the authorities became a way to save themselves, even if it meant turning on Luciano. One of the most damaging blows to his empire came from a man he had once trusted, a man who had been his close ally and confidant. This informant's testimony was crucial in securing the case against Luciano, and the web of betrayal grew tighter with each passing day. The arrest itself was swift and dramatic. Luciano had always been a man of control, someone who meticulously planned his every move. His ability to stay one step ahead of the authorities had been the hallmark of his criminal career. But the law had finally caught up with him, and the arrests were more than just a tactical victory for the FBI. They were a symbolic victory in a larger war against the Mafia. For the American public, the arrest of Lucky Luciano was not just the capture of a criminal. It was the end of an era. It was the beginning of the unraveling of the Mafia's power, a shift in the public's perception of organized crime, and a reflection of the government's increasing resolve to stamp out the underworld's influence. The trial that followed was one of the most high-profile events in the history of organized crime. The press flocked to the courtrooms, eager to report on the latest chapter of the Mafia story. The trial was a spectacle, drawing attention from across the country and beyond. Luciano, a figure once seen as untouchable, now sat in the defendant's chair. The courtroom drama unfolded like a movie, with prosecutors and defense attorneys fighting tooth and nail to make their cases. For Luciano, the stakes had never been higher. He was no longer just a mob boss. He was now the face of the Mafia itself. The very notion that such a figure could be brought to trial and potentially convicted was a sign of the changing times.